Welcome to They Live by Film, a film discussion podcast focusing on the Criterion Channel and beyond. My name is Adam Lundy, and I'm joined as always by my co-hosts Zach Bryant and Chris Haskell. How are you doing today, guys?
Good. How are you?
Awesome as usual. I'm quite tired. I stayed up till 3:30 on Thursday night watching the NFL draft just to see the Oakland Raiders reach once again,
The
and then
Las
went to bed.
Vegas Raiders. Don't
Oh yeah,
forget.
the Las Vegas Raiders. Yes, see them reach once again, and then go to bed angry at 3:30 in the morning. So I've been I've been living off that tiredness
Were,
ever since.
were you a fan when Al Davis was the owner? Because you probably would have been more disappointed.
The man, he'll just pick them if they're fast. That is this way. He loves the speed. Yeah, but fastest guy will pick him. He don't. If can he catch the ball? Who gives a shit? He's fast.
That's what percentage of Ireland is up at past midnight watching the NFL draft?
Higher than you would think. It's been getting really popular the last few years. As much as it pains me to say it, it's the Patriots have really helped with that, because obviously New England would have a very high Irish connection. So a lot of people would have, either traveled to Boston or know people from Boston, and then became Patriots fans through there. And because obviously the Patriots are sort of a huge commercial thing, it sort of grew from there. So it's gotten really, last sort of 5-6 years, it's gotten really, really popular. I don't know who would have stayed up to watch the entire thing, because I doubt, like, it was only halfway through, and it was 3:30 in the morning when I was going to bed, and it was only halfway through the first round. So I don't know who would have stayed up for the entire thing, but I'd say there was a decent number watching.
Well, before we came in, I was going to say that this was the cross-country road trip edition of the podcast.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's me again.
What's going on? How you doing?
Pretty good. I finally got some rest. I was telling Adam before you got on, I got to sleep in a bed after spending several nights on the ground, so it was nice to sleep on my mattress.
What did y'all bring? Like, go camping, I guess? Is that why?
Yeah, for most nights. I did stay in a hostel in Las Vegas. We stayed at, if it got bad enough, we were just like, we're going to stay the night in a hotel. Like when we were in Lake Tahoe, near where the Donner Party ate each other up, we stayed in a hotel. Seemed like the best thing to do. And beyond that, yeah, we were Oregon and stuff. We'd like to camp near the beach and stuff like that. So it was fun. Hadn't camped since I was a Boy Scout, so it was exciting to try to figure out how to put a tent up again.
That's awesome.
Cool. So we'll crack straight into it then. So the first film we're going to be talking about this week was one that we watched a couple of weeks ago. It's a 1964 Japanese new wave film from Hiroshi Teshigahara, which I didn't rehearse. That's the first time I've ever tried to say the name, I promise. This was a really interesting film. It was kind of one of a landslide winners for one of our polls. A lot of people seemed to really like this film, and a lot of people recommended it. I'd seen it mentioned a lot on the Criterion subreddit before this, as in terms of like a recommended film. For those who haven't seen it, really brief description from IMDb reads, an entomologist on vacation is trapped by local villagers into living with a woman whose life task is shoveling sand for them. Yeah, that's pretty much the most basic way you can talk about this film. Literally, this guy in the desert misses the last bus home back to civilization. These local villagers say, "Here, come stay in with this woman. She lives in a sand pit. You can go stay with her." He gets dropped into the pit, and he's not allowed back out again, and he has to do this task of shoveling sand out of the pit to try and keep the house from basically getting taken in by the sand dunes, basically. But yeah, the film is a lot more wilder than that. I don't know if you guys have any initial thoughts you want to jump out with.
I guess I can start. So I want to start with the negative first. Here's my great nitpick as someone who grew up in a mining community. Their plan is dumb. They really should be getting like trucks down there. If they need this sand, it's like putting a coal miner in a hole and saying, well, we'll fill up the train eventually. I just think it's a bad plan. I think they should have worked harder on it. I don't care if it's parable. Give me some realism.
I was
But
gonna say, I don't think it's really about getting the sand specifically from there. There's plenty of sand dunes around.
but in all seriousness, no, I really liked it. It was enjoyable. I'm not gonna have anything probably too hard in depth, but it's this God, I'm trying to think of the Greek tale now. Sisyphus, yes.
Sisyphus,
The
yeah.
whole idea of the story of Sisyphus, rolling, doing the same thing every day, has this feeling of what the working class kind of goes through. Do you live to work or do you work to live? Sort of idea. Really enjoyed it. What about you guys?
Yeah.
Do y'all think it was about there's obviously this is a metaphor or a parable or there's an allegory here somewhere, right, on the way. Do you think it's about the way, like you just said, Zach? That's an interesting idea. The concept of like maybe the working class. There's another angle I was thinking of as I was kind of going through this around the possibility of like looking at identity, because he had his kind of identity stripped throughout the movie. I was just curious to hear what y'all thought. Before we get into that, I'll just say really quick. I think this is one of those movies that like I can't watch every weekend or something. It's not like a light kind of fun watch.
Oh yeah.
But I loved it. I mean, yeah, I think it's a movie everybody should see. It's one of those stories that I hope gets passed along. But anyways, yeah, that's what kind of I wanted to dig in with y'all today a little bit, is around what is this? What is the allegory actually trying to get at?
Well, I included a quote in my review because it was a quote that jumped out at me while watching the film, and I actually paused it to write it down to make sure I wouldn't forget it. And it's, "Here we are, ruthlessly exploited, yet happily wagging our tails." And this is a point about halfway through the film when Junpei, the character who has been captured, is basically sort of giving out about the whole situation with the woman in the dunes, saying that essentially he's being made to work, do this monotonous, almost pointless job, just for little to no gratification. He doesn't get paid. He doesn't get anything. So I definitely could see it as that like the Japanese New Wave is obviously something. It was a period of cinema that really looked at Japanese culture at that time and really put a lens on it. As we saw with one of the other films we watched, Death by Hanging, which was obviously looked more at the whole idea of the death penalty and the looking back sort of with guilt at the colonization era that Japan had earlier in its history. And this one seems to look more so at the idea of the working class being this exploited class and I'm trying to think of the right word now, but expendable, being expendable. This guy could just be taken. Nobody's going to look for him. Nobody's going to find him. Nobody's going to care. He can just be taken and made to work till death, and that's it. Simple. And I think that film really looked at that. But yeah, one thing that really jumped out at me about this film, more so than the metaphors and things like that, is just the direction was phenomenal. Every shot was really incredibly planned. Like I said, that the way he shot sand was just amazing. Sand is probably the most easy thing to shoot boringly because it's just frickin' sand.
Right.
But he did it completely opposite. He shot it like it was an ocean, like it was moving, like it was an organism. The direction, I really can't say anything higher about the direction of this film. It was phenomenal.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's like I like the because there's even moments in the movie where it's almost as if the sand becomes waves, right?
Yeah, for sure, absolutely.
And he even has a quote at one point where it's like, I think he pretty much talks about that, like building a house on water. And I think he equates it to that instead of having, like, it was like something like, why build a house on water when a boat would have done better? Or some idea of that.
Yeah, I think I remember that quote, something along those lines.
So there was a sense of desire from the characters to get to the coast, right? Because they were basically coming up to a river, right? So there was a little bit, or an ocean or something. So there was a bit of a natural kind of tie-in between the sand and the water, but I've never really thought about it till you just said that. I don't know if the water represented freedom or not, but it does seem like there's a tie-in here between like kind of the desperate dryness and like desperation of the sand, and then that water which is so close.
And something that he that he desperately needed throughout the film as well. Water is a resource that he didn't have easy access to. He was just given a pail of it. I think they said something like every few days or once a week they were given this massive pail of water. So he was given essentially a taste of freedom by being allowed to have that necessity.
And you were talking about identity, and that's kind of, without spoiling, that kind of becomes a part of his identity towards the later part of the film.
Yeah.
Well, just on that point, so you're this kind of ties together some of the stuff we've been talking about so far for me. So, Adam, you were talking about this idea of like the working class and maybe like how they were treated, and maybe this is a commentary on that. And then the moment where it switches for our friend here is when he takes ownership of being able to produce water, right?
Mm-hmm.
And from that moment on, he kind of shifts towards wanting to escape, to all of a sudden like thinking differently about his relationship to that house, and like I don't know, are we talking about spoilers or not? I'm trying to be careful here.
I think maybe we'll just say we'll say maybe towards the end we'll do a spoiler warning section and say.
Okay, then I'll just say like as he becomes more invested in the process, his perspective of where he's at in relationship to this kind of prison changes, right? And he starts to take ownership of it a little bit more. And I think that's a really interesting change that happens a lot in workplaces where they give you a project or they give you something and they're like, you take ownership of it, and then it's harder to leave even if the conditions are bad.
Well, I'm going to kind of tie this in just because I live in the Appalachians. Coal is big here. I mentioned that before.
Yeah.
But one of the things they would do a lot here, and you'll still see like them as museums, but the sense of working, the way they kept control of these workers was essentially to not pay them, but to make them feel like they're getting paid. They'd get different types of currency they could spend at that store. It wouldn't be good anywhere else, but it was good at the coal mine store. So that's where you'd buy your milk because you weren't getting paid anything else. So almost like giving them this house to keep up is a similar concept. Like this is all they have. And
Wow.
as you'll keep them going as long as they have that. And that is the only hope they can have, is something that's just so small and something they should just have anyway.
Dude, that's super interesting. I want to have a whole nother podcast just asking you questions about what you just said. But basically you're saying that we don't know what it is until we're in the situation, but there's a minimum level of like ownership or agency that we need in order to kind of like keep going on something, even if it's putting us in a bad spot. And
right. I mean, you look at you talk about coal miners, they go on strike and stuff, and eventually their strikes finally work to get them actual American currency. But yeah, I mean, they set them in this hole by just giving them these needs. Like, oh, you need milk? Well, you can buy it with these four coal bucks we have here.
Wow.
That you worked forever for, just so you can feed your family and you can keep a house over their head.
Interesting. Not something I'd ever heard of before. Obviously, why would I have heard of Virginia history in Irish school? But
yeah, may not be a very popular topic.
Yeah, no. But yeah, that's intriguing, especially how it ties in here, because giving him the water and giving him this purpose of trying to create water himself is it's kind of giving him it, like we were saying, but maybe the taste of freedom. He's kind of creating his own freedom with the water. And I suppose when you talk about maybe water representing freedom in the film, there's an interesting part that happens where he does manage to briefly escape, but ends up running into quicksand, which obviously is kind of like a mix between the two, and he theoretically almost drowns in the quicksand until he's sort of rescued by the captors and put back in the hole again. And that's kind of a real turning point for him as a character. He doesn't try to escape again, because by nearly escaping, maybe we could say he almost got too much freedom and ended up drowning. And now he has his purpose. He's going to stay in there, and as he tries to bargain with the captors, instead saying, "Just let me out just to see the ocean once a week or something." He just wants that small taste of freedom.
I wonder if there's a few when was this movie made in relationship to Brazil? This was made in
64.
Oh, before Brazil. Okay.
Oh, yeah, long before Brazil.
Yeah. Because this idea kind of shows up in Brazil as well, right? Around like what are the things that people need to feel like they have like a little escapism from this crazy world that's being built around them.
It's been a long time since I've seen Brazil. I'd
I have
say
not
10
seen it. It's
years.
been on my list.
No. Anyways, yeah, there's just this idea that this future has been created, and they're out of control, and there's something they want to escape to, right? Is the main character in that movie has something that he wants to escape to. It's interesting how, like, it's almost like I don't want to get too deep into this, like, because I can't really back it up with evidence from Women in the Dunes, but like it's almost as if we're saying like there's a physical prison they're in with the stand and the house where it is and like in location, but then there's also kind of like a mental prison that they're forcing them into, and like once they're there, they're like their identity is almost changed a little bit to where they, in order to find happiness, they like adapt quickly to this new surroundings and like just need little taste of things that they took for granted before. And like how quickly, we shift as humans into like the things we need in order to stay sane and kind of, feeling somewhat in control of our lives. Cause it, like he would have, before he got in there in the pit, he never would have said that like I just need to see water once a week, or he was like, he had his career, he had his family, he had all these things that were important to him, and once those got stripped away, it's like he quickly changed and and had like a new version of what that was that was important to him.
Well, what I think is really interesting with their dynamic with the man and the woman is, even though he doesn't ever expect to have to say that, he looks at that every day. He has seen what acceptance looks like and what complacency and all this. He sees it every single day, and there's almost like this. Of course, there's this resistance to that until eventually it's almost an attempt to break who he is. It's to break him down and to being just being a worker, being who she is. She's just wants the little things in life to make it a little bit easier.
So in the thread that we've been talking about, then who do the villagers represent? Because they're not like well put together, organized, smart people. They're not represented that way.
I would say they're representative of the like upper management, or like corporations, who are a lot of corporations, despite them making a lot of money, are horrifically mismanaged. And
The decision makers, essentially.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. Like if we're gonna go with this idea of Junpei being forced into work he doesn't really want to do or care about, to the point where he is essentially being exploited, which all across the world that happens. Cough, cough, certain warehouses for certain big corporations.
Check our Amazon affiliate link down below.
He said it, not me. Don't block my Amazon account. Yeah, but like it's something that still happens, and obviously has been happening for thousands of years. Man will exploit the weaker man if he can. That's just human nature. You see it in a million different films and books and series and everything. If the people in power will, even the smallest amount of power, they will abuse it as much as they can. It's just human nature.
Well, and there's also this element, like, of course, before we see, I'm sure a scene we're going to talk about here in a little bit, but the scene where we just have the few guys who take him down to the hole, they're just like, they're kind of, there's almost like this deception there of just saying, it's going to be nice, you're going to do this, and it's almost like the people who hire you.
They're human resource.
Later,
yeah, they're human resource guys.
Yeah, and then later you see the true face of the corporation. The guys with the mask. You have this nightmarish thing, and it's all just right there in the open. And this is the point where you've accepted, well, I'm stuck here. I mean, there's the same thing when you have a dead end job. I'm stuck here. I've seen what this place really is, but what am I going to do about it?
What am I going to do? I might as well get my little kicks here and there. Which for him is, which Junpei is trying to sort of make his own water source. That's his little kick. That's what he gets out of having to sort of be stuck doing this monotonous job.
That he feels like means everything to him. Like he wanted a legacy, and this is his legacy for him. This small little victory.
They've effectively broken him down to see the world differently, to where this is the thing that's important now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like he moves away from bugs entirely, right? And it becomes like something else entirely, even though that
yeah. Well, he becomes a bug, essentially. He becomes the bug that he himself was capturing. Obviously, the very start of the film shows him capturing a bug, putting him in a glass, and just watching it to see what it does, and he essentially becomes that himself, trapped, having people observe him.
That was a good quote, Adam. I got chills. That's exactly right. He became a bug. That's the quote of the podcast right there. So you're saying that Amazon, when they hire people for the warehouse, on the job description, they don't put "you're going to have to pee in a bottle." It's because you're not.
I would respect the hell out of them if they actually put that in the job description.
They were just
like,
honest.
Hey, we told you.
They were just honest. Yeah, it's like it was in your contract. You signed up for this kind of thing.
It's interesting. Yeah, that's so true. Because even like, okay, man, I don't want to get too far off on a tangent. I promise you, I'm trying super hard here. There's a whole thread. But like, there's even been evidence that there's still child labor, like in 2021, that goes into like one piece of one thing that goes into an iPhone, right? It's not like Apple's hiring children, but it's like one of the components that's needed to make it run the way that it runs is mined somewhere in Africa with children, right? And like, even with that knowledge, like it doesn't stop production of the iPhone, which, it's, or by the way, I don't mean to pick on Apple or Samsung or Google phone, whatever. Like it's an important part of like cell phones. And like, in theory, like that should just stop. Like, it's not like a big like human rights advocate to be like, oh no, we don't want to hire children anymore. That's right. Like I forgot.
But then but what we hear is, oh, it's going to cost $3,000 or $4,000 to have that phone if we stop that. Ooh, that might be a little too high, because that's how people justify it. Like, oh, well, it'll make a $4,000 phone.
Oh, you want adults doing the work? Oh, yeah. That's going to raise your phone up by $1,000. Like, sorry, it's not. Yeah. So anyways, yeah, there's a whole nother discussion around like how we're disconnected from the supply chain and how that doesn't inform our purchases. We don't have to get into that. But for the purposes of this, like, I have not really thought about it strictly just as a metaphor for work before, but I love the way this conversation, like where we went with this. I think this is exactly right.
Yeah. I think it's still like, I'm sure that you could probably, like with a lot of films, especially art films like this, you could probably put it into a lot of different holes, pun not intended. But you could do that. But I think the workforce idea, especially with the quote that I said that Junpei says himself, here we are ruthlessly exploited yet happily wagging our tails. It's so true. Like it rings true to any person who's ever worked in an office job or anything really, or like even like working in like a supermarket, anything like that, where you are directly under the thumb of someone else, having to do something that you obviously don't love. This film is gonna kind of ingratiate itself to you if you get the metaphor. We're talking like it's a very easy metaphor to pick up and go sitting there going, yeah, this is all about exploiting workers and everything like that. We obviously had to have a 20-minute conversation to land at that point. So, but if you do pick up on that, this film will ingratiate itself to you. Before we talk about the ending, just one shout out I want to give out really quickly to this film was its soundtrack. Loved
horror movie soundtrack. Yeah.
Yes, I love the score. This atonal smacks and crashes of just noise. It just really helped create an atmosphere. And if you can get one thing right with your film, is make sure it has a good atmosphere. You could have a crap plot, you could have bad actors, but if you get the atmosphere right, then the film is almost always gonna at least be good. Maybe not a masterpiece, but it's always gonna at least be good if you can get the atmosphere right. And the music, the music in this film, like if I can really even call it music, because it was literally just atonal hits of noise, but brilliant. It really set the mood for the film.
So this guy's name is Toro Takemitsu. I'm looking him up right now. I don't know this, but before right now, I'm just looking him up. But Adam, how was the music in Black Rain? Do you remember?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I assume you're asking me because he did the score for Black Rain.
No, I'm just curious separately from that. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
No, he did.
Okay, I genuinely can't recall off the top of my head, but I would not be surprised if it was somewhat similar to this.
Okay. Well, yeah, because he also did Ran, which has a lot of very much like Kurosawa's Ran, which is very minimalist.
Yeah.
And he did the documentary Antonio Gaudi, which have y'all seen that? It's really awesome. Anyways.
Oh. I'm not.
Similar, very, very minimalist soundtrack. So he seems to be like and he
Oh,
did
he did
Empire.
Waidan as well, which
Yeah,
does very minimalist soundtrack. He did a lot of great films. Harakiri as well,
yeah.
from Kobayashi. He worked with Kobayashi and a lot by the looks of it. Yeah, this guy did a lot of good scores.
So
This
maybe,
dude has worked
yeah,
with pretty. This dude has worked with some of the greatest Japanese directors ever. So you have Tezuka Hara, Masaki Kobayashi,
yeah,
Michiro Shinoda,
yeah.
Yukio
Kurosawa.
Naruse, and Kurosawa, and Oshima. This dude worked with some of the great directors that were working in that era. He's obviously very highly thought of, which he should
The
be.
John Williams of Japan.
Yeah.
Maybe the Philip Glass.
Yeah, Philip Glass.
Yeah, probably Philip Glass is more in line with what he's doing, or Johnny Greenwood or something. Is more in line with what this guy makes. But yeah, I love the score. I suppose we might as well jump into the ending then. So, spoiler warning for anyone listening who hasn't seen the film and doesn't want to be spoiled. So, if you want to maybe skip ahead a couple of minutes. So, the ending of the film. This is one part of the film I didn't. Well, at the very very end I loved. The sort of lead up to it I didn't love because it kind of just it had a time jump that wasn't very obvious, and it just kind of came out of nowhere. So the woman in the dunes whose name I completely forget if she's even named.
I don't think she's named.
Okay, that makes me feel like less of a sexist dick that I remember the guy's name and not the woman's name. So obviously she falls pregnant and ends up having some sort of complication. So they have to go in and rescue her and bring her to like the village doctor or something like that.
Mhm.
And Junpei stays. He could have left. If I remember correctly, they don't even pull the rope up at the end.
They don't.
He stays he stays there. So, and then we see there's a news like a sort of newsreel basically telling us the audience, and I don't know if this was actually obvious in the Criterion version of this because I don't know if there were subtitles for it at all. I had to look it up afterwards to say exactly what it said, but essentially he's been missing for 7 years. So one thing the film does is not make obvious how long Junpei has been in the pit. There's no obviously like title card saying 7 years later or whatever. It's not very obvious how long he's been there. But the fact that he's been missing for 7 years and that the film kind of ends on that strange note. Did you guys like the ending? How did you feel?
You know, I kind of like that element of it because like when you're down there, he probably doesn't have any real sense of time, you know?
It's true.
Like if I had sat there and, they didn't say that, I would have assumed it's been several months, maybe a
Yeah.
year. And then when it says 7, it almost like hits you like, ah, that's awful that it's been that long, and it's it broke him down. I mean, at the end, it really did. It kind of reminded me a lot. He had the opportunity to leave. It's kind of like how wardens at prisons will talk about when they take them to the chair or take them to the lethal injection table. They don't put them there; they walk there on their own volition. They'll strap themselves in and be ready. And it's almost like that type of brokenness and how long that really takes.
I was thinking of it like war vets who have trouble acclimatizing back to civilian life once they come back from tour, and a lot of them just end up going back because they're just so used to it. Yeah, they're just so they just can't acclimatize to normal everyday civilian life. So that from that sort of angle as well.
That's so true. There's an interesting. Just stick with this theme of work and kind of how this is relating to work. That's a common thing to say. You can be like, "Oh man, I can't believe I've been here for 7 years. Where's the time gone?" Or like,
Yeah,
just this idea of being like, you hate the job, but all of a sudden, like 4 years go by, and you're just like, "Oh man, what am I doing with my life?"
so
I'll
true.
put in that application for somewhere else tomorrow, and that's kind of what he does at the end.
Yeah,
I'll worry about escape tomorrow.
yeah. But
Basically.
for now, I'll just try to fill up that concoction that I've built that allows me to get water anytime I want. Like it's like what is that whole thing? The Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like he's figured out a way to get his base needs met, right?
Yeah.
Which in this case is water. And I guess I don't know what he's doing for food. I guess they still bring him food down. They still drop food down.
Yeah, because I was waiting on the crow, and I guess eventually, if he's down there long enough, he'll figure out a way for the crow too. But or try to get some type of food. But that's down the line, and that's just his next project, just like at work. You always feel awkward leaving a job because you're like, well, I'm in the middle of something. Let me finish this up, and then I'll leave.
This has me so depressed now.
For people with dead end jobs.
It's true though. It really rings true to like dead end jobs, office jobs, that kind of stuff. Not every office job is a dead end job, but
right.
you know the type where you're not really gonna go anywhere. You're just a very, very small cog in a massive machine, and you're sort of left to feel like that as well.
I'm not surprised. This is apparently in Tarkovsky's top 10 films, especially after talking about this. That doesn't surprise me now.
Yeah, I suppose it is sort of shot meditatively.
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
think that's the word.
It is shot like that, like a lot of Tarkovsky films are too. Tarkovsky would have started his career around this time. When was Ivan's Childhood made? 1962. So this is 2 years after Tarkovsky's first feature film. If I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure Ivan's Childhood was Tarkovsky's first, which is probably the sort of least arty of his films. So I'm sure he probably took influence from the way this film was shot into his own style.
Yeah. There's at least his first big one. Looks like there was is this a short? There's something called Steamroller in the Violin. I've actually never heard of it.
Yeah, I think that's a short film.
It was
part of it when he was in the Russian Film Academy, whatever that's called. I can't remember.
So yeah, 1962, and then Andrei Rublev is 2 years after this one,
which was where he sort of started developing his long, sort of slow cinema. So yeah, I could probably see this being a direct influence. I enjoyed this film more than I enjoy Tarkovsky movies. I'm not a huge Tarkovsky guy. It's a bit too slow for my liking.
The pace of this stayed pretty consistent. Like I never felt slowed down.
Oh yeah, 100%. Like I said it to some guys in the Discord who were kind of, obviously this film was 2.5 hours, 146 minutes long. Yeah. And there were some people in the Discord along with myself who were kind of worried about the length because, it's especially the way we do it where we have to watch the film and you have to kind of choose which day you want to watch it before the week is up. And it can be hard to fit that kind of film into your workday life. So I was kind of worried, and then I watched it pretty much the day after it got chosen, and I said, guys, this film is so well paced. It doesn't feel slow. It's not like we're sitting down to watch Satin Tango here. We can, it's sort of, even though it couldn't be as far opposite as Once Upon a Time in the West. I feel like from a pacing point of view, even though obviously one's sort of more actiony than the other, I felt no issues with the pacing in this film. I thought it was really well paced.
Yeah.
Any final points before we move on then? Anyone want to bring up anything in particular?
No, there's just in like a consistent theme in the podcast, just like closing loops, the open loops from the podcast. So y'all were trying to figure out the name of a soundtrack where all the music comes from within the movie.
Oh yes.
A few weeks back, is it Diegetic?
Diegetic, yes.
Is that okay? Because I'm sure our listeners have been like frantically trying to search for that now. So I thought I would close the loop.
Yeah, because I was trying. I can't remember what the other one's called. The one where it's not from there. It starts with an A. But oh well, that'll be for next week when I realize what that word is.
I'll look up diegetic antonym.
Antonym.
Antonym. Yeah, it's like the opposite of a.
Oh, you're just typing it.
Non-diegetic, apparently.
Okay, well, maybe I'm thinking of something else, but yeah, that'll work. We'll say non-diegetic, so I'll feel better.
In the Discord, we were chatting about these Dogma 95 films that were out from like Von Trier and and that's a big deal in the Dogma movement. Was the music had to come from within the scenes? There could be no soundtrack or anything. So, anyways,
they were a bit too harsh on themselves. Those guys, they give themselves nothing to work with. I I never really took to that movement, just like, what's the point? Just make the film you want to make. Why do you have to stick to all these rules? You're just sort of limiting yourself for no real good reason other than saying, oh, my film is the most dogma. Your film did this, so it can't be dogma. It's just like, who gives a shit? Like,
It's the
just make
worst
the film
one
you
up
want.
in history.
Yeah, it's so crap. It's the worst one. Oh, you used stage lighting for one scene. No, you're not dogma. Go away. Just fuck off. Just make the film you want to make.
So that's why Barry Lyndon was shot the way it was. No stage lighting for that.
Kubrick just really wanted Von Trier to love his film, so he was just obsessed with making who was probably a very young Lars von Trier happy.
He just knew. He saw him as a baby. He's like, I have to impress him.
I have to impress this dude. This gotta do it. That's why he acted like Hitler on his sets as well, because he just knew that Von Trier would take to that. So, it's all coming together. Jigsaw falling into place.
All right, welcome back to Collection Corner. In what seems to kind of accidentally be a reoccurring theme now, we have another special guest this week, which we're very excited about. For anybody who's on Reddit, and specifically on the Criterion sub, we were able to find time with one of the mods, who goes by the name CaptainGibb. And our captain is a fierce collector of all films, but has a particular knowledge and expertise around kind of silent cinema, and really even a level beyond that, really getting into some specific niches and subgenres within the very vast world of silent films. And so I think this interview for me was fascinating. It was really eye-opening to think of the fact that the most diverse time in history for filmmakers was actually in the silent era, and we've just gone backwards since then. I think CaptainGibb brings a lot of experience and knowledge and wisdom into this conversation, and I learned a lot, and it made me. I have now 2 movies from Flickr Alley based off of the recommendations he gave, and I think that y'all are going to learn a lot as well. So here, without any more of me talking, here's CaptainGibb. So CaptainGibb, thanks for joining us. I reached out to you just through the comment section, I think, sometimes over the past few years, because I noticed a trend that you had a particular interest in silent film, in which you let me know that it was even further refined into like women Soviet filmmakers, but pulling back Soviet, silent films for sure. I have 2 real questions just kind of out of the gate. First of all, how did you, what was your path from being a 10-year-old that knew nothing about film or whatever age that was, to then discovering a love of film and then getting into silent films? Because that's not completely typical, although I think it's awesome. And then, and then also, we'll get into more of the collecting side in a moment, but I'm just curious as to, you think the role of preservation and kind of, the importance of collecting silent film now, physical media, but I'd love to hear that journey from you, because that's an awesome, I'm sure there's a story there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So growing up, I always watched movies with my family. Every week we'd have pizza and a movie on Saturday night. So I grew up watching, the normal films like Lord of the Rings, Indiana Jones, those movies I grew up watching. And then it wasn't until about high school, actually, I started getting to film a little more seriously. I took in an AP English course, and the teacher actually had us watch some films. In that class, it was Hitchcock specifically that we watched. And he's actually the person who I first heard about Criterion from. We were talking about Guillermo del Toro and his films and their availability. And he mentioned, what is it? The Devil's Backbone is only released through Criterion at the time on Blu-ray. And so that's kind of the first time that Criterion name kind of bounced around. And he introduced me to some interesting films. One of them actually being Irreversible, which is an interesting film for a high school teacher to recommend. But
yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
Yeah, he started telling us about it. And he's like, actually, maybe I shouldn't. So me and my friend kind of got it out of him. And then I watched it and was, mind blown. But
yeah.
And then in college, I started, I majored in psychology, and I was looking at what else the college had, and I ended up minoring in film studies. And so I took a few film studies courses, and then I took a women in film course. And I was expecting it to be more of a historical look, but ended up being more of a contemporary look about like feminist issues, using film as a medium to look at it. And I kind of wanted a more historical approach. So then for the final paper, I said to the professor, I'm like, hey, can I kind of, pick my own research topic? And then I did a little bit of research and I found Alice Guy Blaché, who was the first female filmmaker dating back to, the 1800s. And then I did a research paper on her, and that kind of just opened up my world to, the silent era, and specifically the women in the silent era. So that was kind of the big segue. But actually, I realized I skipped a step. When I first started getting into Criterion, I watched Charlie Chaplin's The Kid. I got that from my local library. It was one of the first silent films I ever watched. When I saw it, I was completely blown away. It was a Criterion Blu-ray, and blown away by how like engaged I could be in a film from, was that 1921, I think. I'm just amazed at how old that film was and how just completely engaged I was. And then from there on, I just started watching more and more silent films, and that's probably what sparked me to think about the historical approach in that woman film class.
Wow.
But
That's cool.
yeah, so I think that's pretty much the journey.
Yeah, as Chris was saying, yeah, the silent film, it's not really an area that many people look at, especially early in their, in their sort of film journey. I think even a lot of seasoned film watchers are still kind of afraid to touch it. Like one of my big things this year is I'm trying deliberately to watch more silent film. I've fallen a little bit behind. I've only watched like I think 10 or 11 this year so far, but that's definitely more than I watched last year. So it's cool that you got into it so early. I'm really interested to learn about this silent female filmmakers, because I honestly can't name any. I think the earliest female filmmaker I can think of would be like Riefenstahl or Dorothy Arzner. I genuinely can't name any female filmmakers before that era. So I didn't. Yeah, I'm not sure how big their role was. So was that more of a Hollywood? Would they have been based in around there, or would they be more sort of spread out in the film sort of map?
Yeah, there's actually all over had a lot of female filmmakers.
Okay.
Actually, it's interestingly enough, during the silent era, more women worked in the film industry than any other period, including right now.
Oh, wow.
Which
Okay.
is wild. And like some prominent female filmmakers have written about it. And I think it was Lois Weber. Well, I meant to talk about her a little bit more later. But I think her comments were, since the medium was so new, everybody was just trying to figure out, what the heck they were doing. Then nobody started noticing that these women were taking foot and, starting to become prominent figures in this industry. And actually, that figure, Lois Weber. So in the silent era in the U.S. anyway, there's three big filmmakers. Everybody knows Griffith. Everybody knows, Cecil B. DeMille.
Mm-hmm.
And then Lois Weber was actually the third giant, but nobody knows about her, which is wild to me. But
do you have any theories as to why that is? Because you're saying at the time she was on par with them. She was getting funding. Yep. She was completing projects. So what happened?
Yep. Even she was working at Universal actually. Actually, Universal hosted. I think they had the most female filmmakers there at the time. But even some people like at the time said she might, she's probably the best filmmaker, regardless of, she just happens to be a woman. And those are some like contemporary reports we're talking about of her. So what happened? I think a lot of it is how we know film history, because women were kind of slowly written out of film history as time goes on, for whatever reason. I'm sure there's lots of theories out there about why, but I won't get into that now. But at least in the very early years, there were never like an Alice Guy Blaché and these other early filmmakers. They didn't have like titles on them, like who was made in the film, like who helped make the film. There was none of that. So that sense of authorship was not there. So people associated like Alice Guy Blaché, all of her films, her other contemporaries. Like she was just sort of there.
So it's just got lost because there's no record of it, essentially.
Yeah, that's part of it. There's no record. That's mostly for the earlier stuff.
Right.
The newer stuff is just, I don't know. I think like Weber's films are very political. Like she was very politically conscious, and I think that may have made some people uncomfortable. And she made some films about abortion, birth control,
Wow.
things like that. Yeah, back in the 20s, which is wild.
Wow. Yeah. It's amazing pre-code. Some of the stuff that came out, some of the content was really interesting. So one more question before we get into the collecting
Yeah.
side of it, because you got me curious now. Okay, so you got into women through women's history course, and then what was the connection to Russia or Soviet films? How did that
Oh
come
yeah.
about?
So that was actually through another film course I took. It was Soviet and Eastern European film,
Okay.
and she was a fantastic professor. She was like fluent in Russian. She studied in this back when there was the Soviet Union. She's fluent in multiple languages, and she really pushed me to like explore different films. And then again for that course, I got to pick a film and do a project on it. And since I already had the interest in women filmmakers, I actually was looking at Flickr Alley's early women filmmakers box set, and I noticed they had a film. I'm gonna butcher her name. I'm sure my professor would cringe. It's Olga Preobrazhenskaya. At least that's how it's written out. So yeah, so I saw that film, I'm like, huh, that's interesting. And then I did a whole research paper on her and about her and about women's role in the Soviet Union at the time making films. And you kind of asked earlier about like how it looked across the map. Women were making films in the Soviet Union, but they were kind of stuck making like children's films because it's still like a womanly, quote unquote, womanly role to make films for children. And she's actually the first filmmaker to kind of step outside that role and make a serious drama. And that kind of, helped pave the way for other female filmmakers. There's actually some interesting books about Soviet women in the silent era. One is called The Red Woman and the Silver Screen, I believe. I have it right up there. Something to that effect, Red Woman on the Silver Screen. And that's all about women of the silent era, as well as some interviews with them. So if you're interested to read more, I'd recommend that.
Yeah, I'm very interested. I mean, one of the things that's coming out in recent years now, we're kind of cycling back to a point where we're realizing, I'm putting air quotes because this is an audio podcast, not a visual one, but we're realizing that people of diverse backgrounds and genders and race, they have unique stories to tell, and these stories can be really interesting and compelling, right? But that was kind of a forgotten thing for many years there, where it looked like you had to look a certain way or be a certain type of person to tell a story. So it's interesting that this was going on for a while in the beginning of film, when it was sort of the Wild West, and it was just kind of whoever could get funding and a camera. Wow. So I know, but you mentioned Flickr Alley. What are some of the labels that are doing the best work at preserving this and putting them out on Blu-ray or physical discs?
Yeah, so Flickr Alley is one I'm a huge fan of. I've been working actually collecting all of the releases, just because they do amazing work. They are all of their restorations come from Lobster Films. I'm not sure if any of you guys have heard of them. They do a lot of the restorative work. They do in the UK. They work with other labels to release some of the films they've restored. And they're a big one. Honestly, Kino Lorber, they get a lot of hate from people for whatever reason, but they do a lot of really wonderful work with the silent era. They probably release the most silent stuff that any other label releases. And then beyond them, Milestone Films, a lot of people aren't familiar with them. What I like about them is they tend to release lesser known films about marginalized communities and marginalized filmmakers. Specifically in the silent era, they released two films, In the Land of the Headhunters and The Daughter of Dawn. Those are both films with, I believe, completely indigenous casts. And so basically telling these indigenous stories. And like I said, they released both of those. They released some Lois Weber films. And so they do a lot of really interesting work. Who else? Grapevine Video. That's one I feel like most people have not heard of. Grapevine Video. They're really interesting because they do all the restorations themselves. They have Kickstarters, and so they have a Kickstarter. They have their own prints that they buy and restore and then release. They're all unfortunately, made on demand discs, so the BDRs. So I think that's what scares some people away. And honestly, the packaging is not the best. So it's like the guy, made the covers back in like 2002. use scissors to cut them out.
Okay.
But the discs themselves are good. But
The movies are good.
yeah.
Is it classic media? No, there's one more too that classic flicks, classic movie. There's one more the two that I've seen referenced before a lot. Anyways, while I'm looking for that, we had two podcasts ago we had the gentleman on who started up Fun City Editions, and that's a passion project for him. And his day job is actually working with Kino Lorber.
Okay.
So that's I'll make sure he gets. I'll tell him that you called out specifically as being one of the best for silent films. I'm sure he'll be happy to hear that.
Yeah, and they've honestly been releasing silent films since the VHS era, so they've been consistently restoring or releasing these films. And I like just to shout out one of their releases. It's called The Movies Begin. It's a DVD box set. There's 5 discs, and it's honestly like a film history course in a box. I know that gets thrown a lot for like a lot of people like call Criterion that, but this is literally like film school in a box, because they have essays that go along with each of the films. I think they call them like program notes. So you can literally like read an essay on your screen and then watch the film associated to it. Then just go through the whole box set like that. And it's literally a film course.
Wow,
That's cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. I like I'm going to talk about a documentary now for a moment, but
yeah,
that sort of reminds me of Mark Cousins' Story of Film, which I've seen the documentary and I'm reading the book now at the moment. That's like my evening reading, and that kind of brings me into obviously what you're speaking about with women filmmakers. He has a documentary series on the Criterion Channel, the Women Make Film series. Mm-hmm. I don't know if have you seen that? As I haven't seen it personally, so I'm just wondering if it is interesting, because I'm sure it probably covers a lot of that early era too.
It is, yeah. I've seen the first couple episodes, I believe. I haven't finished it yet. There's so much on my, to watch list. Yeah. But yeah, it's good. I recommend it.
Awesome. Yeah, there looks to be like quite a lot of episodes. I just have it up here beside me. I think there's something like 14 episodes of it. So it seems to be. I'm sure he gets very in depth. He's a cool guy, Mark Cousins. I do appreciate him.
I know there's a lot of common questions that come up when people are trying to get into film, right? Typically in that kind of 14 to 17 year age, like you watch, there's like one thing you see and you're like, kind of your mind gets blown about the capability here. If you have any advice or experience around, early silent films to try, if you're looking to dip your toe in the water, or especially even then like female silent filmmakers to try, if you're looking to dip your toe in the water. Not to put you on the spot, but I'd be curious to see what you say for that.
Yeah, I would say step outside the normal slapstick comedies. I feel like when most people think silent era, they think, those Chaplin-esque slapstick comedy films. I mean, don't get me wrong, Chaplin's wonderful. And he's a lot more than just comedy. But I feel like that's what a lot of people they're watching starts and ends with Chaplin, or possibly maybe the general like a Keaton film or the Throne Metropolis, because it gets talked about so much, but that's usually it. So I'd recommend just checking out other mediums, other genres inside the medium. It's a lot of really good horror films and good experimental films. As for specific recommendations,
or if it's putting you on the spot, like, or just kind of like what that looks like. So, so you start with Chaplin and Keaton and, and then like, where do you go to even find these resources, or where do you go to even kind of like start to, are there certain lists that you use or certain kind of places you would go to research this?
Yeah. So for me, basically what I did was I watched what labels had available. So I kind of used that as my foundation. So since Criterion was my first boutique label that I collected, I think I basically exhausted their list of silent films pretty quick. Mm-hmm. And then I kind of moved on to other labels. So that's kind of how I chose it, because the way I kind of looked at it, if a label, chose to distribute a film, it's got some value, it's got some, markability to it, right? But I like going by filmmakers themselves. Like if you watch a film and if you like it, look to see who the filmmaker was, and then check out some of their other films or film movements. Like German Expressionism tends to be a movement that a lot of people who aren't into like silent films kind of gravitate towards. So it's got that very strong aesthetic flair to it, right? That even though there's no sound, it still kind of draws people in because it's got that, crazy expressionist aesthetic.
One silent film that I saw this year that I really liked, and it kind of opened my eyes a little bit, because some people, and even myself, my past self, would have assumed that obviously outside of comedy, you're probably not going to get a lot of. Maybe silent film could be maybe boring, and obviously you touched on it there with German expressionism, with the visuals and the aesthetic. It's very, very arresting. And one film that I watched this year, and I'm wondering if you've seen it, is called The Last Warning.
Yes.
You've seen that film? That
Yes.
film just blew my mind. I watched it back in February, so I was still pretty early. Like I'm just having my letterbox here beside me because I need to remember what I've seen this year. So like up until that point, I'd seen three pretty much stone cold classics. I'd seen Safety Last, which I loved. Sunrise, which it's one of the best films ever made. It's incredible. The General, which was really well made from a production point of view. I didn't find it as funny as or I didn't find it as enjoyable as Sherlock Jr., but it's really impressive from a production point of view. And then I watched The Last Warning, which is just completely different. The camera just moves around so much, something you wouldn't really associate with silent film. Camera just running around, jumping around, going up and down levels and things like that. So would I assume you'd be in the same boat as to say that silent film probably gets a bad rap for potentially being boring when it can have the completely opposite effect on people?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I think part of the issue is people watch YouTube rips of silent films, which are generally, atrocious quality. If it does have music, it doesn't fit, the aesthetic of the film. Sometimes the playback speed is wrong, so it looks super sped up, right? So I feel like just the presentation of it gives people kind of like this bad, these negative feelings towards it. But honestly, The Last Warden's a great film. It's Paul Lenny. He's the one who directed it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with him. He was an expressionist filmmaker. He worked as an art director in a lot of these iconic expressionist films, and he emigrated to the United States because of the rise of Nazism, along with lots of his contemporaries. But
yeah, it was a great film. I don't know who released it in Region A. I obviously got the Region B, and that was from Eureka, who do a lot of great silent stuff for Region B. They're probably the biggest output of silent films in Europe. They do a lot of early Fritz Lang, and later Fritz Lang. To be fair, they cover Fritz Lang pretty well. They have early Lubitsch. They have Murnau, so they do a lot of good output for silent films. But yeah, The Last Warning, it just completely blew my mind when I watched it, because although maybe it's kind of cheating because they did make a sound version of the film as well, but the sound version is considered lost, and then it's just the silent version remains. But yeah, that film just completely blew my mind from a technical aspect. Just the camera work in it was insane.
So you mentioned earlier there was a company, I think it was Grapevine, that was doing Kickstarters for restoration.
Mhm.
I'm curious. So we had on a few weeks back, we had on the guys that were formerly with Cinelicious and then Arbellos, and they're breaking off. Two of the guys are breaking off and starting a new label. And there's one particular release they did called Belladonna of Sadness when they were over at Arbellos. And they said that was a particularly difficult one. And the restoration process for that was $150,000. So I'm curious, when these Grapevine campaigns coming out, what is that threshold where they're trying to get for the restoration? Do you have any sense of that, if you've been tracking them?
I actually don't remember offhand. They're not that crazy because I think they're not like pulling these things from these old archives. I think they're finding prints wherever they can, and they're not like 35 millimeter prints. They're not original negatives. I think they're quite often like at home prints, like 8 millimeters, 16 millimeter prints. So they're not as high quality scans as other labels do, and maybe not as extensive in terms of the restoration. But I know restoring films are very expensive, especially like looking at how much they've deteriorated, how much work goes into it.
Yeah. Well, and then the other thing we learned, which I think ties really well into what the era that we're talking about, is that most film only has about 100 to 150-year lifespan before it starts to degrade pretty heavily. So that adds even extra element of importance of, I think, collecting and trying to support these labels that are putting out silent films, right?
For sure. It's actually interesting that you mentioned that, because the time spent on a film really depends on how it's stored. In let's tell awful conditions, it could be upwards like 10 years, and then it starts deteriorating. I believe the first time we heard about film deterioration was in India. It was like 10 years after they started storing these films, stored in hot, humid conditions. They had these films, they contacted Kodak and basically like, hey, our films are starting to deteriorate. The original estimation was like 400 years.
Okay.
They were supposed to be, preserved, but obviously that's not the case. And then it's even less than 100 years, because have you guys heard of it's called vinegar syndrome?
Mm-hmm.
I know you guys know the label. Do you know how they got their name?
It's I've heard the story, but yeah, it's basically like the breakdown in the actual physical film itself causes it to basically. I'm sure you'll probably explain it better than me, but yeah, I know I do know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so it's kind of fun that that's how they kind of what they drew the name from. It's called vinegar syndrome. Basically, what happens is the film starts deteriorating, breaking down. The acid in the film creates this vinegar odor, and that's what the name comes from. But basically, it gets very thick and sticky, and basically the film reel turns into like a brick
Jeez.
that they can't separate, and then it's lost forever. And it's also highly flammable because they used to use nitrate celluloid, which is used in gunpowder originally, but before they switched to acetate in the 50s. So they'd have all these issues of these film prints that they have, honestly, like spontaneously combusting. I think the George Eastman collection in the 70s, they lost like 300 films because they're in their vaults because they're just caught on fire randomly. And that's kind of one of the problems with film preservation.
I'm glad to know Quentin Tarantino wasn't lying in Inglourious Basterds then, when they lit up the theater at the end with all that film. So obviously, like time frames we're talking about now, obviously we're 2021. So even if we do get to that 100-year mark, you're losing out on the sort of first 2 decades of narrative film. Obviously, there was experimental film when it first came out in the late 1800s, but you're missing out pretty much on the first 2 decades of narrative film if they're not preserved. Like the earliest film I've watched this year was from 1919. It was the first part of The Spiders from Fritz Lang. So if someone hadn't saved that, it would probably be gone now and lost. You wouldn't be able to watch it, which obviously happens to a lot of filmmakers, like the likes of Long or Murnau. The early guys, a lot of their early films, you just can't get them. They're lost, and so film preservation, just to keep a hold of a bit of history, because that's essentially what film is, a small piece of history, really. So it's important that these companies are supported to do that, to make sure that we're preserving not just the artistic merit, but essentially a little physical piece of history.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the interesting things about, how we're finding these silent films is the way they used to distribute them is now, theaters rent out films from the distributors. But back then they'd actually buy the film itself and then they could play it as much as they wanted. So now we have these two different ways in which these films are stored, either by the people who buy them, but also by the studio. So if the studio has a big vault fire, there's still these collectors, there's still these, theaters who still have these prints. Like The Passion of Joan of Arc. That's an incredible preservation story. They found it in a asylum. I forget which country it is from. If you guys remember, please jump in. But they found it in an asylum janitor's closet.
I remember hearing something about it. I don't remember the country. The preservation story I know is is the one from Metropolis, where because it was so they basically cut a load of footage because it was so long before they went and go to show it in America, and the original version was unseen until it was found in 2002 in an Argentinian museum. How a German film got to an Argentinian museum, I'll let you connect the dots. But yeah, that's the crazy preservation story. I know, like, to think that nearly an hour of footage of one of the most epic silent films of all time could have been lost if not for it was found in a museum in Argentina. But yeah, I remember the janitor's story for Passionate Bark. I don't remember the country either, but yeah, just crazy places that you just pure luck, and it's great that you get those moments of luck. And I suppose who knows, in the future, maybe more films that have been considered lost can be found.
Yeah, and the one downside though is to finding these films in these obscure countries is whenever they shoot silent films, they use three different cameras and shoot basically using three different cameras to get three different negatives. So you'd have the main camera with the main director's intent, then you have alternate angles. And so basically, at least in the United States, the original print would be distributed in the US, though a secondary take would be, like, say, in the United Kingdom, and then the last print would be all elsewhere in the world. So you might find a film, but it's going to be composed of completely alternate takes, which creates a really unique, challenge on restoring these films.
Yeah, that's interesting. My preservation story is not as old, but my favorite one is about the BBC used to record over all their old negatives for the TV shows. And John Cleese, on a whim, heard about that and bought the first 2 seasons of Monty Python back from them before they were about to record over it. Otherwise, all those shows would be lost forever. And you just think about, like, there just wasn't the same attitude towards preservation. And it wasn't even that expensive to go buy another reel. They just, they wanted to save a few bucks or a few pounds, I guess.
Yeah, it's a lot of early Doctor Who is lost because of that as well, because they were just recording over them, which is just insanity when you think about it. But I suppose you don't really think in the moment. Obviously, back in those days, obviously now it's easy because everything's digital, so it's very hard to record over or lose something that's digital, especially after it's already aired, as somebody's probably torrented it and it's available for everyone to pirate anyway within 5 minutes of it airing. But I suppose you don't really think in the moment. You don't realize you're putting out something important. So it's like, we'll just record over this. It'll be fine. But yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. Well, no, that's why I it's a big deal for me personally, Eric and Adam and I and Zach, who wasn't able to join today, but we talk about this a lot of times. It's why it's, for me, like, I do enjoy collecting anyways, but I do feel like there's kind of a mission and a cause behind it. And we're living in an era where I just got in the Dungeon of Andy Milligan from Severin, and, like, it's kind of wild to think that Andy Milligan films are getting this really pristine care and output into Blu-ray, and I hope that conversations like the one here with you today, like, this is, I'm hoping that this same attention and love is kind of moves, like, from the 80s, 70s, 60s, and it kind of keeps getting, down into the teens before it's too late, so to speak. Because I don't want to, I would hate to look back and all of a sudden realize that we've just lost, like Adam said, 2-3 decades of film just because there wasn't the interest there in collecting. So
I'd like to throw out one more statistic. Everybody, I'm sure most people have heard the statistic, like 75 to 90% of silent films have been lost. Most people know that statistic, but another one that people don't realize is in the talkie era, I think up to the 50s, we've lost about 50% of those. And that's a number I feel like most people don't think about or hear about, but that's a lot. And so that's, going into the era that you're talking about.
wow.
That's probably more into when they started the conveyor belt of films, kind of, isn't it? Where they were putting out hundreds and hundreds of films every year. And I suppose ones that weren't deemed good enough at that time were probably not saved, but could have been reevaluated at later stages. Like one of my favorite films is Night of the Hunter. And if someone decided, this didn't do very well, let's just record over this, or let's just throw out this nitrate, like, the world would have lost what I consider to be probably one of, if not the best film ever made. So yeah, I'm the amount of lost films is kind of insane from any era, really. Obviously silent, or even into like the early classic Hollywood studio system era. But yeah, I'm hoping that whether it be Criterion or whether it be someone else puts out more silent, I think Criterion are definitely lax. Maybe that's because Flicker Alley and Kino and stuff already put out a lot anyway. But like I'm just looking at it here, and you can tell me I'm wrong if I'm wrong. But one film I've really wanted to watch, which is a Russian film, Earth. I've heard great things about it. It's mentioned a lot in Mark Cousins' book, The Story of Film, and I really want to watch it. But from what I can tell, it doesn't have a Blu-ray release or anything like that.
It does not. It's got a Kino release. They released on DVD. There is a UK box set with some other of Dovzhenko's films. I think there's 3 of his films in that box set. Actually, another Redditor pointed it out to me. They sent me a message telling me about this box set and asking if I'd heard of it. But yeah, Earth is a fantastic film. The print is pretty rough. I'm not sure what the surviving elements look like, but I think it's really interesting because when most people think about Soviet films, they always jump to that like Soviet montage, like Eisenstein, or Vertov, Man with the Movie Camera. They don't think about these other types of Soviet films that were being made that look and feel very different, like Earth.
I'll have to try and track down this box set then, because it's a film I've wanted to watch for a long time because I've read so much about it, and I'd love if somebody was able to put it out on Blu-ray. It would be phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, Captain Gibb, Eric, thank you so much for making time to spread the good word about silent films.
All right, and welcome back. I hope everyone enjoyed that little interview with the captain. Now we're going to be talking about Paul Thomas Anderson's first film, Hard 8, also known as Sydney, which is about a professional gambler, Sydney, teaches John, played by John C. Reilly, the tricks of the trade. John does well until he falls with a cocktail waitress named Clementine. What do you guys think?
I liked the film. I like it as a character study more so than anything. I thought the characters were by far the best part. I think the plot was pretty thin, but the characters sort of elevated the film for me. It definitely feels like a first film for an accomplished filmmaker. It's not bad. It's absolutely not a bad film in any way, shape, or form. I think I gave it 4 stars out of 5, which is pretty much my baseline for good films when it comes to my letterboxd. So, not a bad film at all. But characters were definitely the best part of the film for me, anyway.
It's interesting. They Shoot Pictures has this movie at 7,402, which feels a bit unfair. I mean, not that They Shoot Pictures places it, but it's interesting to me that critics don't rank this higher.
Maybe biased because of what Anderson did afterwards.
Yeah, and from my understanding, this isn't his cut of the film either, which has always been a big hot topic point. That basically they forced him to change the name, and then it was recut. So I'd be curious to see what his original version looked like, and it might be a lot different.
Oh yeah, bring out the Snyder cut.
the PTA cut.
The PTA cut. Release it now.
No, I want the 4.5 hour Snyder cut. I want Snyder to re-edit it.
He just goes in and just instead of CGIing mustaches off, he CGIs mustaches on Gwyneth Paltrow.
That would be amazing.
That sounds like the perfect film for me.
Yeah, I think Adam. I think I'm with you. I think it feels like a first movie.
Yeah.
And when you look at like we just by total coincidence we happen to have seen a lot of first movies on here, right? Like we've seen Shoot the Piano Player, and we happen to have seen a lot of first movies, and like the thing that I was kind of reflecting on, like I think it's been at least a week since we saw this, maybe 2 weeks.
Yeah, about the 2 weeks now at this stage.
Yeah, and so like in memory, I guess a little bit now, like where the emotion is gone. The thing that jumps out to me is like the confidence of it, because like that's really hard as a first-time film director. There is a big difference, a big gap in first films from people that go on to become Paul Thomas Anderson or Truffaut versus people that have like a middling kind of film career. And this one to me, I can't believe as a first film sitting down with Gwyneth Paltrow, John C. Reilly, Philip Seymour Hoffman was in it, Philip Baker Hall, like Samuel Jackson, and just like having to have like the confidence to direct them into your vision. and he pulls it off. Like I think it's great. You know, and,
Yeah, like I definitely wouldn't say anything bad about the direction of the film. It's like the direction is. I think honestly, where it falls down for me most is just is the plot. But to be fair, like the way the characters and the atmosphere kind of do elevate that. I think if this film had crappy characters and wasn't directed as well, it would just be one of those, you know, films you see in a bargain bin in Walmart. You
It
know,
would have been called like, oh, it was just trying to rip off Jackie Brown or something like
yeah,
that.
exactly. Like I think the one thing like Anderson always does really well with creating atmosphere. I mentioned it earlier in the podcast. If you can create good atmosphere, then it will elevate your film. And the same can be said here. Like this film gets called a neo noir, which I can see. It certainly
Yeah,
has.
I could go with that.
Yeah, it has. I think it doesn't quite live up to some of the tropes. Like I wouldn't necessarily call Gwyneth Paltrow's character a femme fatale in a way. I don't think she's really smart enough to be a femme fatale, but
No,
uh,
she's way too impulsive.
yeah. But at the same time, she still causes the downfall of the main characters, even if
Yeah.
it isn't something, even if it isn't like a well laid out plan like Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity. It's not like she's that kind of level of femme fatale, but
Right.
like in noirs, the downfall of the main characters is normally down to getting roped into a crime by a woman. That's like one of the most biggest tropes in film noir. Main character gets roped into crime because of woman. You know, and then this film kind of does the same thing, but in a maybe more modern way, perhaps.
Well, I think it's interesting that you kind of mentioned that because she's getting John C. Riley's character is the one who gets roped into it, and then by association, Hall's character Sydney gets roped into it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting that because I was going to bring up that I feel like the thing about using Hall, which I think is always so interesting, is he is for most of his career he's been a supporting actor, a character actor, and this one he gets the leading role. So you saying that almost feels like John C. Riley really is supposed to be almost like this main character, but we're seeing it from the perspective of, I don't want to say side characters. He has the most agency in the film, but it almost feels that way in a way that we're seeing it from the almost like the helpers side. Like, oh, I know this guy. I like the wolf from
I was gonna say it'd be like we
Yeah.
watched like Winston Wolfe's perspective going, these fucking guys, I gotta clean up their mess.
Right.
You like if I don't know if I think I read one time there was an idea for Tarantino to make a Winston Wolfe film, but I suppose that gets said about every Tarantino character. It's good about how he needs to make a full film of those. But yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. It's like watching the film from Winston Wolfe's perspective, or obviously in this case, watching the guy who has to clean up the mess rather than the guy who's created the mess.
That's interesting. I know there's like I agree with you, Adam. There's not like deep themes here. Like it's relatively straightforward. And it's more about a character study, but there is a theme of either like loneliness or maybe like maybe the stronger theme is like white lies and kind of like how that plays out, and how far people will go to try to protect those. So there are a couple of themes that are like explored.
Yeah, I think the most obvious is the sort of need for connection. When we meet Sydney and John at the opening of the film, John has said that his mother's passed away. He's needing to get money so he can bury her. So from what we can gather, we'll talk about this later in the discussion. For what we know right now, John has lost his mother. It's his only family. He obviously can't go to anyone else for the money, and that's why he gets tied in with Sydney. And obviously, we learn very early that Sydney himself is completely disconnected from his kids. He doesn't even know where they live. So they almost become a de facto father and son. John becomes connected to Sydney. He looks to him like a father figure, and Sydney wants to look after him like he's his son. And then obviously, Clementine himself, even though she's a waitress, she has a normal job. She ends up prostituting herself because she just feels a need for connection. She's obviously very insecure and feels need to be desired. So I think that want for human connection is something that's the sort of major theme of the film for me, anyway.
That's a nice way to sum it up. Yeah, I think that's right, and it guides a lot of the actions of everybody, right? Because even as the story unfolds, even Jimmy, Samuel Jackson's character, like even he is connected to all of this and like knows a lot of the backstory and is like there's a reason he's there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's not totally random that he's in these guys' lives. So it's like it does become this weird, like kind of enmeshed family with all the dysfunction and everything that families have.
Jimmy's like the weird uncle who comes to tell all the family secrets.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
But on the note of Jimmy, I didn't really like his inversion into the plot. I liked him more as a side character. The way they kind of like Samuel L. Jackson's awesome. He does Samuel L. Jackson things. You know, this character of Jimmy is like the most Samuel L. Jackson character you could write.
Yeah.
He fits the role perfectly. But I feel like he was kind of wedged into the main plot. You know, it just didn't really seem to fit. He just kind of came out of nowhere with this bombshell, and there wasn't any real lead up to it. We'd only seen Jimmy very briefly earlier in the film as a friend of John, and that's it. We just know he's a friend of John. He just kind of inserts himself into the main plot in a way that just didn't feel organic to me, and it just felt like a way to kind of throw a bombshell.
Right. Yeah. And I kind of agree with what you're saying a minute ago, Chris, with the confidence thing, but I do think this might be the area where he may have had like some hesitation, is with the pacing, because I don't necessarily dislike Jimmy becoming sort of a main antagonist sort of idea. I think it can work, and I think all the events, which we'll get into later, I think they work if they're more fleshed out and more developed. I mean, and this isn't necessarily to do with as much with plot as just giving me a little bit more of these characters. Because I mean, if we're going to talk about Paul Thomas Anderson, a lot of his films have pretty simple plots, but doesn't mean they're not. Like There Will Be Blood is an insanely simple movie that's 2.5 hours. But because the characters are so interesting and because things keep changing and dynamics keep moving, it keeps you interested in it.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what this movie needs as well, is we need more with Jimmy.
Yeah.
For him to have those moments towards the end and they feel earned, so to speak.
When we're talking about this feeling like a first film, that's the thing that jumps out to me, is like there's a lot of sort of convenience built into the writing. That is like, I don't know, I hate to, like, indicative, I guess is the word I'm thinking of like somebody who's early on in their career and maybe doesn't, have like that. I hate to call it a student film, but like it's the kind of script that somebody who's extremely talented would write as one of their first scripts, right?
Yeah.
It's basically because the plot needs it. That's basically his reasoning for doing things, because the plot needs it, rather than letting it sort of develop organically or have proper build up. It's like, okay, well, we need this to happen now, so let's just make it happen now.
Right. Almost as if he had this main through line of Sydney, and he got there and he was like, oh, the story needs something else.
Needs resolution,
right? And like, how can we kind of do this? And then which like descended into, or like, got him thinking about another character coming in from the previous life, and then how does he insert into the movie? And like, I can almost see this like playing out on a whiteboard or playing out in like a writing session or something.
Yeah, because I feel like with Sydney, his downfall, it goes through the idea that his sins come back to bite him, and it's going to take away what he perceives as his family, the connection he has. But it puts it in an external sense. It's, we put that on Samuel Jackson instead of that being more of a personal thing. More, he has to either deal with this or he's going to lose them himself, not because Deus Ex Samuel L. Jackson knows some stuff that he doesn't want John to know.
Right.
More of it'll eat at him and stuff like that. I still think it works, and I still like a lot of what happens. I guess I'm just going back to, it needs just more development, or it needs to be more internalized.
Yeah, for sure. That's what my main issue is. I don't really mind about the direction it took. It was just how it got there. It just didn't feel organic.
Yeah. There's this interesting thing. I don't know. Maybe there's more to say about the movie. I want to talk about 1996 before we end this segment. But do y'all want to talk about the ending or anything first before we get into that?
I don't think we actually have to for this
one.
I
don't feel like we have to spoil that.
Yeah, no, I think we're good. If you're a listener listening now, don't worry, we're not going to spoil the film.
I was born in '82, so when I was in high school was right around the time this came out. I was just starting high school, kind of getting into film a little bit, like moving away from the next Disney movie or the next like Lethal Weapon movie or whatever into like like something that's a little bit more. Well, I shouldn't say Lethal Weapon. I still love.
How
those.
dare you
Yeah,
shit
Lethal
on
Weapon
Lethal
is
Weapon?
awesome.
Yeah.
I feel like we have to
You
end the
heard it here.
podcast now.
You heard it here first. Lethal Weapon is not patrician, apparently. Okay.
That's awesome. Whatever, and it's something a little bit more, art housey or whatever. And it was a really, I think, historic. Like looking backwards now, it was a super interesting time to be in that kind of influential age and like range of looking for new films and new directors, because you've got movies like Swingers, really strong independent movie, right? You've got movies like Kingpin. You've got movies like The Frighteners, From Dusk Till Dawn. You've got movies like, I hate to bring in Jerry Maguire. I think that's an interesting, even though it's a big budget production, it's an interesting one. The English Patient, the retelling of Romeo and Juliet that was very theatrical. Biodome, which is kind of dumb. Happy Gilmore, which set comedy in a new direction. Are you
just not going to talk about The Rock?
No, just getting to that. Then you've got
the true auteur.
So anyways, you've got all these movies coming out. And a lot of them, if you take a look at like kind of what happened, it was this next generation of filmmakers. Like this was an early film for them, right? And I think, I don't know exactly when Bottle Rocket came out from Wes Anderson, but it was around this time.
Around the same time too, yeah.
And so you've got this huge wave of filmmakers that were like just getting going. And it was a really interesting time because by the time I started university was in 2000, a lot of these folks were making their second or third movies. And I entered into this time where like I happened to be in Dallas, which at the time it was over 30 independent screens. So you could drive 30 minutes or 40 minutes from where I went to school and find 30 different screens playing independent or foreign or art house movies.
It's awesome.
And
I was sad I was only 2.
You had 2?
No, I'm saying I was sad I was only 2 during that time.
Yeah. So it was this really cool time in history where, like, whether it was the new Takashi Miike film from Japan or which is these like really absurd, crazy cinema, or the new Wes Anderson movie here, or like, the new Michael or Michelle Haneke movie, like what all these movies were like kind of coming into the theater right when I was in university. And like, it's fun to think back to 1996 when this was all kind of starting, right? Like Kevin Smith was around this time. Like you could just go on and on and on. Like a lot of the people that have become like institutions for that generation, this is when they were getting started. So it was a fun trip down memory lane for me watching this.
Yeah, Bottle Rocket was 96 as well. I just looked it up. So same year. I suppose probably the biggest director in the world that started in the 90s around this time was Tarantino. Also,
exactly.
Who again, like Reservoir Dogs is good. I don't love it, but it's a good film, but it has a kind of
but it's same area.
Yeah, it has a kind of similar feel to this kind of film as well, where he's setting out things that he would develop later on in his career. In Reservoir Dogs, it's not obviously as well rounded or as polished as later films, which kind of like this, you can see where Anderson was coming from, but it's not as polished. He hasn't mastered his craft yet. So
he's not creating Daniel Plainview or Freddy from The Master yet.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not to shit on the characters he created in this film. I think Sidney was a great character.
Oh yeah, obviously saying someone like Daniel Plainview might be like Daniel Day-Lewis is one of his best characters ever. So
that's one of the best
characters. Anyway.
Yeah, well, like Daniel Day-Lewis is one of the greatest actors of all time, and he would choose his roles very, he was very stringent about how he chose his roles. He would only choose the right film and the right role for him. And I'm probably going to blaspheme here, but I haven't actually seen There'll Be Blood because
you need to change that. I just watched it last night again.
There's no good Blu-ray in Region B, and I'm just waiting and hoping that somebody can put out a Blu-ray for it. That's the only reason why I haven't watched it, because it's not on any streaming here. It's not on like Amazon or anything like that here. And there's just no good. There's just a really crappy Region B that came out like 10 years ago. And I'm just holding out hope somebody releases a good version.
So, how familiar are you guys with PTA? Since you haven't seen There Will Be Blood, which have you seen?
Seen this, and I've seen The Master, which I love. And I saw Punch Drunk Love about 10 years ago, which...
Okay. So no Boogie Nights?
I haven't seen Boogie Nights.
Boogie Nights is good too.
Yeah, I was obsessed with him around the time a lot of these movies were coming out, like first day, first screening in theaters, kind of. So I've probably seen, I don't know how many films he has total. Is it like
8.
11? Oh, it's 8?
Yeah, he has Part 8, Magnolia, Boogie Nights, There
Yeah.
Will Be Blood, The Master, Phantom Thread, Punch Drunk Love, and
Inherent
Inherent
Vice.
Vice.
Okay, I guess I've seen 5 or 6 of them anyways, but I haven't. Yeah, there's a few I haven't seen, but he's just he reminds me of Fellini only in this one way of like when he creates a character, he explores every dimension of their personality. He never takes just like one dimension and says they're like the good guy or the bad guy. Like he goes deep into the character and really you get to see like the whole person. And I think very few directors can and writers can do that to the extent that he can.
Well, I think because it's so easy to put like, well, this is their personality type, and I won't spoil anything for Adam with There Will Be Blood, but that's what makes Daniel Plainview such a good character is he has these soft moments.
Yeah.
And he's such a horrible person at times, but you just get these like little bits of light that come through, and you almost start wondering like, is this who he really is? Is this a facade? And it works that way with Sydney too as a character. Like how bad was he at one time, and how much has he softened up, and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So what you're basically trying to say is Paul Thomas Anderson would be really crappy at writing a slasher film.
Yeah, awful.
Okay, that's
Though
all
I
I
will
need to know.
say, I don't know if you read my review for There Will Be Blood, but it kind of plays off like a horror movie, the way
Awesome.
the movie's set up.
Yeah, I've heard it. This is kind of weird. I've listened to more Paul Thomas Anderson soundtracks than I have seen his films.
Hey, he got
Because
Greenwood. That
yeah, I'm a huge Radiohead fan. They're one of my favorite bands, so I like listen to anything that Johnny Greenwood puts out. So like the Phantom Thread soundtrack, love it. There'll Be Blood soundtrack, love it. Haven't seen the films, but the soundtracks are awesome, and I've listened to them a bunch of times. So, if the soundtrack is anyway like the mood of the film, then I definitely see it very being not a horror film, but having elements.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just checking on this now, but hasn't he actually directed a lot of music videos?
Yes,
Yeah.
I don't know if he came out of propaganda films or not. I don't know if he was part of that movement or not, but yeah, he's big, and I think he still does music videos.
I'm pretty sure he did a Radiohead one a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to say he's done some Madonna.
You're not joking. He's big in for Haim. Isn't that a British band? Haim or Haim?
No, they're American.
Oh, okay. Anyways, he just did a bunch of their stuff.
I always find it funny that like he's such a serious director and he's married to Maya Rudolph. I always find that funny.
About that.
Yeah.
One question on this idea of like this generation of filmmakers that came out around the kind of mid 90s, late 90s. So a lot of them have become like, if you're getting into film, like kind of art house film or however you wanted to say that, there's a lot of these directors that become like the gateway directors, right? Like they're the ones you do first, and then you eventually get into like a Teshigahara film, right?
If you're doing the iceberg, yeah, he's like there's a lot of ones at the top of the iceberg, and you eventually get your way down. Yeah.
So where do y'all think he ranks in terms of, first of all, like a gateway director, but then also like do his films like last beyond that? Like, can you keep, do you think like he's one of the ones where you kind of enjoy him in the beginning until you discover other filmmakers, or do his films have a legacy beyond just like being an intro to art house films?
If I can talk as an outsider from the perspective that I just haven't seen a lot of his films, from a name recognition point of view, he would be like this tier below the gateway directors, so like the tier below the likes of Tarantino and stuff. I think he's a tier below that in terms of name recognition. But I've only ever heard or read positive things about his films. It's very easy for someone to look at the top levels, or like a David Fincher or a Coen Brothers or a Tarantino, those gateway directors, and have bad things written about them. I've said bad things about them on our very podcast.
Watch the IMDb episode.
Yes, exactly. That pretty much that covers it all. But you very rarely, I don't recall ever hearing anything bad about Paul Thomas Anderson as a director. Some of his films have gotten mixed reviews, like Inherent Vice is supposed to be fairly iffy, but obviously that's based on a Thomas Pynchon novel, so that's always going to be difficult to make a film of a Thomas Pynchon novel. But
yeah, he has more hate towards his personal life than anything else.
And I don't even know about his personal life, so I'm only going to even talk about just from a filmmaking perspective.
Yeah.
For me, I think he's like the second level down kind of guy, which, to be honest with you, I think unless you're part of a really small movement like Mumblecore or something, if you're an American director, you're always going to be up near the tip of the iceberg, because obviously Hollywood is the biggest movie machine in the world and has been since film began. So from a brand perspective, obviously I know India probably makes more films every year, but from a brand perspective, Hollywood and Hollywood filmmakers are going to have the most recognition. So I think he's going to be like the second level down, but I think his films endure the sort of the negativity, or perhaps it's even just because, you know, one of these things where because something becomes so popular, people just start to hate on it because of that, which I think Tarantino probably gets that in the neck a lot. Christopher Nolan definitely gets it in the neck a lot for that kind of stuff, but he just doesn't seem to get that kind of hate.
Wait till Dennis, what's his name? The one doing Dune. He'll get that eventually.
Villeneuve or whatever.
Yeah, his turn's coming up.
He will be the new Nolan. I guarantee he will be the new Nolan. He's already coming that way. People roll their eyes. If you ever are in a like circle jerk thread or movies thread and someone talks about this very small unseen film called Arrival, you will have eye rolls all day.
Oh God.
I just don't know at this point in history why anybody would accept a Dune project.
I mean, I give credit for just like trying, like go for it, I guess. Like,
The trailer looks good, you know. I'm not even a Dune. I never read Dune. You probably read Dune, Zach. I'd say.
I've read the first one, yeah.
Yeah,
I haven't read like the 800 novels that came out.
Yeah, there's a ton of those. Like, I'm not a Dune guy, but like the trailer looks good. I'll probably see it. I think Goranson, that guy, is doing the soundtrack too. The guy who did I know him from doing the Community soundtrack, but he's obviously done a lot more famous stuff since then.
I just want to know how he's like convincing these studios to give him all this money. Like, he's like, hey, I want to do Blade Runner, a sequel to that. Remember how it failed in the box office horribly? Well, I want to do that again.
And then it also failed in the box office horribly.
Yeah. He's like, what a shocker, it happened again.
It's kind of like the Chris Nolan effect, isn't it? The way the studios keep giving Chris Nolan hundreds of millions of dollars to make movies, because he threads that line. And go back, if this is your first time ever listening to our podcast, go back and listen to the previous episode, the IMDb deconstruction, because we get into this a lot more. But Christopher Nolan, you know, he's the guy who threads that line between entertainment and trying to be artful.
Yeah. And
because he's the kind of filmmaker where it's not like a Transformers movie or like a Marvel movie, and I'm not shitting on Marvel movies. I fucking love Marvel. But it's not like one of those. It's something different, and it's the kind of film that will get people into the theaters, because people will be like, from word of mouth, saying, did you see this film? It was the craziest film I'd ever seen. Because they don't really watch a lot of non-mainstream films, it gets the mainstream audiences in because it's something different to what they're normally used to seeing, but still very entertaining, which I think Villeneuve has also been doing that a lot with his most recent films. Things like Enemy and his earlier stuff obviously wouldn't really fit in that, but the likes of Arrival, which was really entertaining and really well made sci-fi film, Sicario, very sort of heart pumping kind of film. You know, he, like Nolan, he's making artful films for the consumer, for the mainstream consumer, basically.
Speaking
of talking about Sydney, right?
Yeah. Speaking of artful films for the masses, have you heard of the budget for the Lord of the Rings TV series, just season 1?
I don't even want to know.
It's like, what, half a bill?
$1
billion
I think it's 600 million.
Jeez.
Good Lord.
That's more than all 3 of the movies cost, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. And it's not getting a theatrical release. It's just going to drop onto Prime or whatever, you know, as like a show. It's insane.
That's insane to me.
There's a lot of stuff I could do with $600 million. I just need a piece of that.
It's all that boys' money. They got all that. Now it's like, we can make anything we want now.
Seriously. Yeah, I don't really have anything else to say on Hard 8. I guess we could keep talking about independent versus big budget cinema for a while. But I don't have anything else to say on Hard 8.
Yeah.
It's a simple movie, right? Made well.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah,
it's fine. Yeah, it's a solid 4 out of 5.
There you go.
Solid 4 out of 5. Solid 7 out of 10 by IMDb.
I need that on a poster. Like, when they re-release Hard 8, I want that quote on it. Solid 4 out of 5.
They live by film, yeah. And now, as always, we're entering into our final segment, Any Other Business, where we just want to just give a shout out to something that we watched recently. It doesn't have to be Criterion, doesn't have to be good, just something we watched and we liked, and we want to give a shout out to. I'm going to start, if it's okay with you guys. I'm just going to give a shout out to a film that's going to be getting some press recently because of its Oscar win. It's Emerald Fennell's Promising Young Woman, which, if anything, if I can only say one nice thing about this film, and I have plenty of nice things to say about it, but I can only say one nice thing about this film is Fennell, for a first-time feature director, does such a great job of controlling tone throughout the film. I don't know if you guys know much about the film or heard about it or anything like that, but essentially, like it's a bit of a dark story. Essentially, Cary Grant, or not Cary Grant, Carey Mulligan, very different people. Carey Mulligan essentially plays this character whose childhood friend, while they were at college, she was sexually assaulted, and as revenge, Carey Mulligan goes out every weekend, pretends to be drunk so that a guy will take her home to take advantage of her, and then just completely flips and just goes after the guy for it. Now, for a film which I suppose maybe you could call it a rape revenge film, it's in no way exploitative at all. It's really beautifully made and everything like that. It's one of those films that, yeah, it just manages tone perfectly. It's not an exploitative film, but at the same time has really great moments of tension. There's moments that almost seem out of a horror film. There's really funny moments. It has a really nice, colorful color palette that really juxtaposes the sort of dark sort of nature of the film. I honestly only I have mainly nice things to say about it. I think the pacing was a little off for the first hour. A lot of it could have been tightened up a bit. It's kind of like a rinse and repeat of the same sort of thing that she gets up to every weekend for the first hour or so. But yeah, once it really kicks in, really well made film. Won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay, which, yeah, I totally get. And yeah, I'd recommend it. Promising Young Woman. If you haven't seen it, definitely watch it. It was one of the best films I've seen in a while.
I know it's dark, but I really like that premise for a movie. I think, in the sense that I think it makes a very compelling story. Right?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think like they did a really good job of making it for the modern era too. You know, it's not like thugs went in like the old rape revenge films. Always these sort of country bumpkins or thugs or whatever. The guys that she is catching doing this are all your quintessential nice guys. You know, she really did a great job of showing that anyone could be capable of doing this, no matter no matter what the guy is, apparently how nice he is, or apparently how caring he is. Anyone could be this person.
Wow.
And she does a good job of portraying it. And like I said, not exploitative in any way. If you're triggered by that kind of stuff, it doesn't show any assault. The main assault that she is avenging is not shown. It's only discussed. So if you're triggered by that kind of stuff, which to be honest with you, I don't like watching rapes on film. That's why I've never watched a rape revenge film like If I Spit on Your Grave. I was traumatized when I watched the remake of Last House on the Left, and I obviously would never watch the original based on what I've seen in that. So I don't really like watching that kind of stuff. So if you're triggered by that kind of stuff, don't need to worry about that. This film doesn't show anything explicit, but it's really, really great. And honestly, one thing you can say, the film has lots of great moments of levity as well mixed in. But yeah, it's really, really wild ride of a film. I highly recommend it.
So just
Adam, have you seen? Oh, sorry.
No, Zach, go for it. Go for it.
I was just gonna say, I asked you, Adam, real quick. Have you seen the movie Revenge that came out in 2017?
I know of it, but I haven't seen it. I think Second Sight, I think Second Sight did a release of it.
If you like, I haven't seen this one, so I'm only basing off your comments. You said I would recommend that one. And that one's also directed by a woman as well, which I think helps in these rape revenge movies not get too gratuitous. But really stylish. It's a little surreal. It has a lot of surrealistic elements to it, but it's very tasteful in that sort of thing when it's talking about the sexual assault and everything. So,
cool. Yeah,
find it somewhere. I'd recommend that.
Yeah. Like I said, I think Second Sight did a release of it a year or two ago. So, yeah, I'll look into it.
it helps to have a woman direct these movies, unless that woman is Catherine Breillat.
Yeah, basically, that's the one woman you don't want directing your rape revenge movies, because she will go overboard.
Excuse me. Yeah. So just in the theme of love and maybe romance from a slightly different direction here, the movie I want to talk about is actually an anthology film from Italy in 1962, and it's a 3.5 hour movie if you look at it as a complete film. But what it is basically is 4 segments, and they're completely unrelated. So it's very easy to turn them on and off as you watch each segment. They're all about 45 to 50 minutes long, and it's Vittorio De Sica, Luchino Visconti, Fellini, and then a gentleman I haven't heard of, Mario something. And basically, what they do is they have 4 different takes of love in Italy in 1962. So one of them is it plays pretty straight as like a young couple that's getting married, and they are married, but her workplace doesn't allow married women. They only have single women in the workplace. And so they have to kind of hide their marriage. And he also works there, so they have to kind of hide their romance. And there's a way that it plays out. This is interesting. And then the Visconti one is very much a Visconti. It's very melodramatic, and it's almost like a John Cassavetes movie where this couple is like arguing and fighting a lot, but you can see underneath this really biting way that they're kind of engaged, there's a love there and like a respect there. So it's very kind of it's a unique take on like a marriage, like a people that are further into the relationship and hate each other but love each other at the same time, and kind of that balance. But then the other 2 ones are both from Fellini and from De Sica, are comedies, and they're really, really good comedies. Like I really want people to see this movie. So it's called, did I say it? It's called Boccaccio 70. That's the movie name, the name of the anthology. And I'd have to kind of write it out. It's not an easy, intuitive spelling for non-Italian speakers, but Boccaccio 70. And the 2 comedies are amazing. So the whole premise for the Fellini comedy is there's a guy who's a very sort of like teetotaler, conservative, like prudish kind of guy. And there's a billboard goes up. Do y'all know the name Anita Ekberg by name?
Sounds familiar.
She was the woman in La
Yeah,
Dolce.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
The woman in the fountain with the water like falling down on her. And she's just incredibly like picturesque, kind of like, like view of like a woman, right? Like this curvaceous, like beautiful, like woman. And there's this billboard that goes up in front of his window. He can see the whole thing, and it's her in a milk ad, and it's the most seductive pose possible for milk. And it just it enrages this guy, and he goes to city council to get it taken down. And the whole movie he's fighting, and there's a scene where she comes to life as like a 50-foot woman and like terrorizes this guy, and he ends up falling for her. I mean, there's no spoilers. It's just a silly, like, kind of fun story. And so that comedy and the interplay between him and the billboard and him and the authorities and then him when she comes to life, amazing, really funny, really well done. And then the De Sica movie. So I've only ever seen Bicycle Thieves. I had no idea De Sica was capable of like this kind of comedy. It's so good. It's all about this woman who basically raffles herself off. And it's like there's a carnival, and all the men that are in this carnival are like lusting after this woman. It's a young Sophia Loren, and she raffles herself off for a night. And so the winner, they draw numbers and they each pay to get like a night with her. And she has all these plans she wants for her life, and so she's taking the money and like starting her new life. That's kind of the premise of the movie. But the way that these men are just like, it's like pure id, like if you know like the Freudian, like just pure like impulse and like raw like emotion and lust, and like they're not hiding anything. And the way they interact with her, and the way that she kind of like they zoom out to the way that people are interacting with her, and then zoom into her to see like what she's trying to do with her life and what she's doing with this, is both kind of touching but also just really funny. And I want more people to see this movie. I was stunned. I had an intention of watching like each segment over the course of 4 days, and I wound up watching it in 2 settings because the individual segments are so good. So
that's cool.
What is it, streaming on anything, or do you have to rent it?
I bought it
Okay.
because I'm going through this Fellini one right now. That's like why I watched it. And it's a Kino Lorber release. It's not expensive. It's a Kino Lorber.
Oh yeah, it's Kino. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's I just want more people to see it. Like I think it's the funniest Fellini I've seen, and by far the funniest De Sica. But that's not saying much.
I haven't gotten too far into Fellini, so I may actually try to check that out just so I can, like you said, you can watch it in segments too. So it might be like a good way to ease into it a bit.
Yeah, it's fun, and it's a great, like, I wouldn't say it's like a great representation of what Fellini does like in his other work, but like it's fun seeing his comedy side, like just a straight comedy. He's really, really talented at that. So
Awesome.
Nice.
All right, and I'll finish up. I haven't watched a whole lot where I was out, driving 7,600 miles in 13 days because I'm not very intelligent and did that. I've only had time to watch like about 2 movies. I watched There Will Be Blood, which we talked about a little bit before, and the other one I watched was Hell or High Water, which is a David Mackenzie film, but I guess the name that really is more tied to it is Taylor Sheridan, who is the writer of that, Sicario, and Wind River, and his new movie Those Who Wish Me Dead will come out next month, which he's went into directing his own stuff. Hell or High Water is probably my favorite of what he's written. Sicario is fantastic, but the thing I really like about Hell or High Water is it's essentially about these 2 brothers played by Ben Foster, Chris Pine. Ben Foster, always a fantastic actor, and I think this is probably Chris Pine's best role. But they are brothers who are robbing banks very early in the morning to try to get a certain amount of money, which they go for throughout the film, what they're trying to raise that money for. And during this time, a Texas Ranger is played by Jeff Bridges, is trying to figure out what they're doing. So it's a very basic Western story, white hats, black hats sort of idea. But what I really enjoy about Sheridan as a writer is, he takes those tropes. He's originally from Texas, so he puts a lot of Texas energy into his films. It has that texture of it, and he has such a love and care for one thing that I think is ignored even in older westerns, at least beyond archetypes, which is Native American representation. Even though this probably has his least of any of his films, every time he puts Native Americans in that, you can tell how much he really cares to give more representation to them, how much that history means to the Southwest, and how ignored they are. Now, Wind River, of course, he goes much more into that. It all takes place as a murder on an Indian reservation. This one is kind of the idea that those who took get eaten eventually. And it's, they even have a quote in the film that kind of talks about, 150 years ago, these people took this land from us. It's from the perspective of a Native American, and now the banks have taken it away from these poor people. At some point, it all comes back to you, and it's the idea that suffering is always going to be taken by someone else more powerful. And it's to them, it kind of reminded me a lot of this DB Cooper quote when he robbed when he was taking a hostage on a flight, where he said, I don't have a grudge against your airline. I just hold a grudge. And that's kind of the motivation the brothers have throughout the film, that it's just a lot of it's just a grudge that they feel like they've been, that poorness is a disease, and they're just trying to kind of get rid of that. It's a beautiful film. I think it gets overshadowed by Wind River because it has a lot of the, a lot more about the Native Americans. And then, of course, Sicario was nominated for Best Picture. It gets a lot of love because of that. And it was kind of planted in between these two. And I really think it's his best work as a writer. Taylor Sheridan's interesting anyway because he was kind of a C-list actor who said, you know what, I'm not very good at this. I'm going to go write. And so far, it's just paid off for him so well.
That's cool. That sounds great.
Yeah, it does. Did you see, have either one of y'all seen the series he created called Yellowstone?
I have just ordered it from eBay, so I will be coming in the next few days.
I've never seen it, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's got Kevin Costner in it.
Yeah. It looks interesting, though. And there is, like, again, this Native American representation that looks like it's in the story, so.
Yeah, it's supposed to be about, like, this family owns this land in Yellowstone, and basically the national parks want the land. The Native Americans think they have stake in that land. And I think these oil people want this part of this land, too. So it's basically them trying to it's going over this, who really owns this land, which is kind of representation, I guess, of the U.S. in general. Who really owns this land? Who does it belong to?
Can you just imagine like a guy, I'm just trying to think of anybody who owns a ranch. Like Tommy Lee Jones has a big ranch, right? We were talking about that, like one of the somewhere. Like, can you imagine like the government or a corporation just coming into his big ranch and being like, we need half of it, like, or we need all of it. Like, this isn't your land anymore. You just be like, wait, what? Like, no.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? Like, it's not. Anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, I know because me and you, Chris, I know you live in Texas, so I can't remember which tribes are really big out there. I know where I live, it's Cherokee. So there's I know both of us kind of live around a lot of reservation land as well. So it's a big part of the culture.
Yeah. Texas is it's more like surrounding states. So like Oklahoma is a huge deal.
Asagi, yeah.
Yeah, northern Louisiana is a big deal. Kansas, it's big. But Texas itself, I don't know. There's probably a sordid history there, but
yeah,
we don't talk about it as much. There's a reason there's no casinos in Texas. Let me just say it that way.
You can go to Nevada, which I'll make this a very quick tangent. One of the funniest things when I was in Nevada is I didn't really, of course we know that's the state everyone goes and gambles at, but every time I even went to order chips, they would say, hey, touch this screen with this wheel and see if you win anything. Even when I went to computer, I was like, I got to gamble, and they won't let you like bypass it either. You have to do it, and I'm like, this is so weird. The obsession with gambling in Nevada.
We need some hard eight to teach us the ways around that system.
Yeah, for sure. I remember when Hello High Water came out a few years ago, there was a lot of buzz around it. I never got around to watching it, but I remember there being a lot of buzz. Wind River, am I misremembering, or is that the one with Jeremy Renner and Elizabeth Olsen?
It is the one with Jeremy Renner and Olsen.
Heard that one's very good as well. Yeah, I haven't seen either of them, and I've heard good things about both. I need to get on top of that.
Yeah, it's kind of, it might be interesting to hear it from your perspective where you're not like, you haven't had as much exposure to the frontier life, because it's about like the death of the frontier, the Midwest and the West, and the idea that, the quick taking of land from the 19th century and what's left of it sort of thing. So it'd be kind of interesting to hear yours where there's such Americanized ideas that it would be kind of fascinating to hear.
I'd probably side with the Native Americans, because obviously the English came and took our land about 800 years ago. So, and then forced
everyone
us
hates English. It's fine. Sorry to English listeners.
Screw the Brits.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. So I'd probably side with the Native Americans. It's like, I don't know, this is probably going to be, I don't know how obscure this net reference is going to be. But it's always like, Zach, you're probably more likely to have played it. Have you played Skyrim?
Yes.
So it's like in Skyrim, I always side with the Nords because the Imperials
suck. Yeah, no kidding.
they just remind me of the English, because they come and try and take the land and stop you worshipping certain deities and stuff, and it just reminds me of that. So I always side with the Nords, because they always just remind me of the Irish now the English came over. But that's a tangent for another day, I suppose. Next time when we watch Michael Collins, that's what we'll talk about then.
There you go.
When we watch Michael, well, eventually we'll end up watching Michael Collins or something, and we can go right into Irish history at that point.
Isn't My Left Foot big on that too?
I don't know. I haven't seen it, to be honest. My Left Foot's about the guy with the crippled guy who paints.
Is that Daniel Day-Lewis, or am I thinking something else?
No, that's Daniel Day-Lewis. Yeah, I think he won an Oscar for that as well.
I think so. Yeah.
Oh, I'm thinking of the wrong movie. No. There's a movie Daniel Day-Lewis does that's big on Irish history.
I'm trying to think.
I don't know now.
I mean, if we want to talk about Native Americans, he's
I know the one. The Name of the Father.
There you go.
Yeah, The Name of the Father. There we go.
I haven't seen it, but I know of it. But I haven't seen it. Yeah. I'm sure we'll get there. I suppose Steve McQueen's Hunger, which is in the collection. That's about a hunger strike from an IRA guy. So
a modest proposal.
We're working up towards another week of picks here.
Yeah, pretty much.
That wraps up this week's episode of They Live by Film. If you want to read more of our thoughts, visit theylivebyfilm.com. And you can also follow our Letterboxd, Reddit, and Instagram accounts from the links in the description. For now, take care.